Let's get started. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, and welcome to our event at the occasion of the United Nations 75th anniversary, an event that is brought to you jointly by the Glasgow Centre for International Law and Security and the Geneva Academy for International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. It's a big event, but it's been surprisingly and sadly, I think, small news throughout the year and all over the world. And of course, that might be due to the fact that the UN is marking this anniversary in the midst of an unprecedented global health crisis and in a world that is marked by tension, geopolitical tension and uncertainty, where we're facing many challenges that requiring urgent collective action. Yet the appetite for collective activity, global solidarity seems to be very limited in this day and age. Perhaps one example that epitomizes that in a very sad way, I think, is the fact that just a week ago, the UN Secretary General reiterated his call for a global ceasefire arrangement, hoping that this will be achieved by the end of the year. And yet, within a few days after that, there has been an outbreak of violent clashes bordering interstate war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And I think the Secretary General was very right in pointing out that this 75th anniversary is not an occasion for nice speeches. That is not what we're going to do today. Still, my sense of the high-level events at the UN commemorating this anniversary last week, my sense was that the atmosphere was so bleak, with a no-show performance from the American president, with an empty General Assembly hall. It was so bleak that I've asked our panelists today to add a little success story for the United Nations here and there, if they can. Just hoping that we don't all get drawn too deep into the ongoing chorus of despair, which in the long run is probably not overly helpful in moving forward. And moving forward is what we have in mind. Today, we want to provide a global reality check on just some arbitrarily selected fields, core fields in which the United Nations is working. We will be looking at nuclear disarmament, very mindful of the challenges facing that area, a crumbling nuclear arms control structure as we speak, pretty much. We will be looking to the humanitarian dimension of the United Nations, again, mindful of humanitarian tragedies and protracted conflicts in Syria, Yemen, Libya, and other parts of the world. We'll then turn to the development dimension in the United Nations work, another issue that really is at the heart of the organization's mandate, which is facing unique challenges and which is probably the linchpin for many of the problems we're facing and also may hold many of the answers to moving forward, I believe. And then last but not least, we'll look into the human rights dimension. That has been challenged, I think, for a long time, but erosion is now worryingly accelerated in the midst of the global health crisis. Now, we're very honored and truly delighted to have been able to assemble a level of very distinguished speakers, all of whom have been working in the field for a long time and have outstanding expertise in their respective areas and international diplomacy more generally. I'll keep my introduction short, and before I introduce the panelists, I should say that we very much welcome your interaction here today. Would be happy to take questions further down the line. We have very many participants today, so please, I apologize in advance. We will have to curate those questions. We'll collate them, but we'll try to make sure that as many of your questions as possible will be brought to the panel. I should also mention, please be advised that we're recording this session. The session is part of the United Nations Global Dialogue, and we will post the panel discussion today on the United Nations website, as well as our own institutional websites. So to come to our panel, we'll start today with Michael Biontino, Ambassador and former permanent representative of Germany to the Conference on Disarmament and Ambassador for Global Disarmament Affairs. He will be followed by Natalie Weitzman, a senior legal officer at the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and a former legal advisor to the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is where we first met a long time ago. Then Professor Diane Desierto, who's a very prolific writer in international law, who many of you will know. She has various prolific roles, prestigious roles, among them an advisory function and her involvement in the drafting of a new draft convention on the right to development. And she is ideally placed to tackle developmental issues today. And then last but certainly not least, my Glasgow and Geneva Academy colleague, Professor Niels Melzer, who many of you will know and who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. And so without any further ado, Ambassador Biondino, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Robin. Thank you very much for having me invited to this panel discussion to speak about nuclear disarmament in a United Nations context. Of course, I'm here in a personal capacity only. In 1946, the United Nations adopted its very first resolution, which established a commission to make inter alia specific proposals for the elimination from national armaments of atomic weapons. Almost 75 years later, where do we stand in the United Nations with this endeavor? Let me start with the conclusions. Nuclear arms control and disarmament is at the global level, unfortunately, not a priority issue. However, it needs to be addressed urgently alongside with other very important issues. Secondly, in the light of the continued real risk associated with nuclear weapons and the likelihood of nuclear weapons use, be it by intention, miscalculation, or accident, nuclear arms control and disarmament is as relevant as ever. Thirdly, the dichotomy between the humanitarian approach to nuclear weapons and security considerations has to be overcome in order to make progress. Fourthly, practical measures to address nuclear risks and concrete steps towards a conducive environment are the most promising pathways towards a world free of nuclear weapons. Let me go through these issues one by one. First, nuclear arms control and disarmament as a priority issue. On 21st September 2020, not so long ago, heads of state and government adopted by consensus a declaration on the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. If you read the text carefully, you will find in paragraph 9 entitled, "We will promote peace and prevent conflicts," only one sentence. International arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament agreements and their architectures need to be upheld. Another point in this line is the UN 75 initiative, as the world's largest conversation about current global challenges and the future we're heading towards, comes to the conclusion that nuclear disarmament, among the very other important immediate priority issues, such as access to basic services, healthcare, water, sanitation, education, addressing inequalities, rethinking the global economy, and boosting employment and health, and long-term priorities as access to education, women's rights, climate change and the environment, human rights, settling conflicts, reducing corruption and tackling poverty, nuclear disarmament ranks among other issues will affect the future of terrorism, cyber attacks and nuclear weapons in this order. Therefore, we have to be realistic if we postulate nuclear arms control and disarmament as a key issue at the global level. Second, today's relevance. It is a common perception that in recent years, the international security environment has deteriorated. Great power, strategic competition has re-emerged, and thus risks associated with nuclear weapons and the likelihood of a nuclear weapons use have re-emerged as prime concerns. Contributing factors are, inter alia, the present stress on the nuclear arms control and disarmament and non-proliferation architecture as a consequence of the deterioration of the international security environment. After the demise of the ABM Treaty and the INF Treaty, it becomes increasingly difficult to see how the New START Treaty or an agreement replacing it will be maintained. A fissile material cut-off treaty is not in sight, and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, not having attained the required ratifications, continues only under provisional applications. Calls for a legally binding instrument on negative security assurances go unheeded. In addition, non-proliferation concerns are as acute as they have not been since the entry into force of the NPT in 1917. Furthermore, the emergence of new technologies and capabilities blur the lines in between conventional weapons and weapons of mass destruction, and thus creating new instabilities and imbalances. Examples are conventional high-impact precision weapons, cyber threats, counter-space or space-based capabilities, artificial intelligence applications, such as autonomous weapon systems. Furthermore, a perceived lower threshold of the use of nuclear weapons is a further destabilizing factor, as is exemplified by non-strategic and low-yield nuclear weapons, new delivery systems such as hypersonic glide vehicles and nuclear-powered cruise missiles. And lastly, in addition, we see the emergence of new regional crisis scenarios with global political and economic implications involving nuclear weapon states, as well as non-nuclear weapon states relying in particular on asymmetric means of warfare, and thus the specter of regional crises spiraling out of control. So much for today's relevance. Thirdly, I pretend that we have to overcome the dichotomy between the humanitarian and security-driven approach to nuclear weapons. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons of 2017, negotiated under the UN auspices, is the real noteworthy event in this area since a long time. Upon entry into force, it certainly will contribute to the stigma associated with nuclear weapons. However, even a number of states fully committed to a global zero for humanitarian and security reasons will find it difficult to adhere, since the treaty does not lay out the way to get there. The moral dilemma of democratically elected governments for whom nuclear weapons are part of the security equation remains: how to protect their own citizens against potentially hostile nuclear capabilities without the recurrence to the deterrence that for the time being only nuclear weapons can ensure. Humanitarian concerns and security concerns as drivers for nuclear disarmament have to be reconciled in order to allow for practical and concrete steps. Fourth, and that's more or less my conclusions, realistic practical measures. I'm afraid I can see no ready-made solution. In the light of the above, however, a number of things seem to be clear. As a starting point, indeed, international arms control and non-proliferation and disarmament agreements and their architectures need to be maintained and upheld and added to, in particular concerning the CTBT, FMCT, and NSAs. Furthermore, we should work towards concrete risk reduction measures to mitigate or reduce strategic and nuclear risks, which could include, for instance, political measures. Here, nuclear weapon states should acknowledge the need to ensure that nuclear weapons will never be used again to advance nuclear disarmament. Secondly, crisis and conflict management issues, including, in particular, formalized dialogue fora on political and military issues. Thirdly, confidence building and security building measures, including a dedicated dialogue on nuclear doctrines and policies, in particular, the role of nuclear weapons in national security strategy. And last but not least, technical measures, including crisis communication instruments. Such measures could greatly contribute to an improved overall international security environment, enable and support further progress towards nuclear disarmament, in particular, the reduction of nuclear arsenals towards their total elimination. However, we have to realize concrete risk reduction measures are not a substitute for arms control disarmament measures. They are only complementary. Last but not least, the increasing entanglement of conventional and nuclear systems need to be addressed and measures to be taken to reverse this development. Nuclear arms control disarmament has to be addressed in a holistic way. Politically, legally, and technically, these are very complex undertakings. In my view, only the United Nations has the legitimacy and inclusiveness to tackle them. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Michael Bion-Tino. I'm struck how already just by looking at the disarmament dimension, we probably all get a sense of overwhelming challenges in so many corners, not just nuclear weapons that you mentioned, but the new technologies that I think are also disrupting our understanding, our mechanisms and principles for arms control and disarmament, and where so far, at least, I think we have not really found the way forward. I'm also struck how you say that there are no ready-made solutions. I think that is what everyone might be hoping for in this era of turmoil, but the reality is probably going to be a lot of small and arduous steps into the future. Thank you very much up to here, and we'll come back to disarmament issues during our discussions. I should remind all our participants that you can please use the chat function and you can already submit your questions via the chat function while we're addressing different issues. Don't wait until the last moment, please. We'll probably not be able to handle all the incoming questions at that stage. If you have a specific question, please submit it as we go along. With this, I'll hand over to Natalie, our next speaker, who will speak about the humanitarian dimension of the United Nations.
Thank you, Robin, for this invitation to join your event. It's an absolute privilege to be alongside so many distinguished experts, and a real pleasure to be reunited with you, Robin and Niels, after so many years. It's bringing back nice memories of a happier time. The challenges in the humanitarian sphere are immense and multiple. It's not been easy to narrow it down for today's purposes, but I have chosen three areas of challenge, also trying hard to find glimmers of hope, which I will share with you. But three areas that are recurrent at a minimum in my daily work at the UN in New York, as I focus on, particularly on humanitarian operations in situations of armed conflict, and on advocacy for respect for international law, and in particular, international humanitarian law. So the first area that I'm sure many of you will have been reading about has to do with conflict-driven hunger. There's been quite a bit of attention to this in recent weeks and months with the WFP, World Food Programme, in July, warning that with the pandemic in particular, the number of acutely food insecure people in the world could increase from 149 million to 270 million people by the end of the year without adequate life-saving assistance. But before I turn to the massive impact of the pandemic, I should note that at least until this point, conflict has been the #1 cause of hunger in the world for a few years now at a minimum, and 60% of the world's hungriest people live in conflict zones. Conflict, I think, it's not difficult to imagine how conflict drives hunger, but in addition to civilians being killed, injured, and driven from their homes, livelihoods are lost, agricultural land is destroyed, damaged, abandoned, farms, food supplies, livestock, public services are all damaged and destroyed, halting agriculture, halting food production, rendering food more expensive. Humanitarian operations are often hindered, humanitarian staff are attacked, supplies are looted, and of course there's an immense impact of conflict on economies. Imports cease or slow down, inflation rates rise, currencies devalue, roads are cut off, jobs are lost, food becomes much more expensive and less available. On top of this right now, COVID-19, of course, is exacerbating all of this, in addition, of course, to climate change. And WFP, again with FAO, have explained how the pandemic is dramatically increasing need with an impact on poverty, livelihoods, education, disrupting things like immunization, and also exacerbating fragility and violence, which in turn can drive, as I've just noted, hunger. Now, what's a sign of progress, I would like to think, at the UN is that in 2018, the Security Council adopted a resolution on the link between conflict and hunger, and laying out many of the factors in conflict that will drive hunger, both directly and indirectly. But it also called on the Secretary General to basically sound an alarm when there is a high risk of conflict-induced famine and widespread food insecurity. The resolution asks the Secretary General to do this in a range of ways, through country reports that are regularly done to the Security Council, as a part of his regular briefings to the Security Council on matters relating to the protection of civilians, but actually quite specifically also asks the Secretary General to report swiftly to the Council when there is such a risk. And so on behalf of the Secretary General, just a few, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, earlier this month, the Emergency Relief Coordinator and Undersecretary General for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, which is where I work, brought to the attention of the Security Council the situation in at least 4 or 5 countries, noting all the ways in which conflict is driving hunger there, but also noting the exacerbating factors of climate change, economic shock, and of course, COVID-19. What's also, I think, quite special about this resolution, it's resolution number 2417 for reference, is that it notes all the ways in which international humanitarian law serves as a line of defense against hunger and armed conflict. And so in the Undersecretary General's recommendations to Security Council members and beyond, he noted a few areas of work for all states, including, of course, finding political solutions to armed conflict, but also working to ensure that IHL is respected by all parties to armed conflict, especially as it relates to the protection of civilians and objects necessary for food production and distribution, but also called on states to help counter economic crises, financially support humanitarian operations, and support integrated responses to, of course, address all the exacerbating factors. So this is one area in which we have a direct line to the Security Council, the highest political level that we have right now, to raise the alarm when it comes to conflict-induced hunger. Another area of massive challenge that unfortunately is a perpetual one is attacks and hindrances on humanitarian operations across many areas of conflict. Many of the challenges that we see today pre-exist COVID-19, although there are, of course, new challenges now that we have this pandemic and measures to try to limit its spread. But the pre-pandemic challenges are ongoing and they are perpetual. They include bureaucratic constraints. They include deliberate access impediments, refusals of passage for humanitarians to reach certain areas, often under the control of the enemy. Of course, ongoing fighting, and as I mentioned earlier, attacks on humanitarians, looting, misappropriation of supplies. Speaking of attacks, in 2019, the Aid Worker Security Database noted or recorded 483 attacks against aid workers in 277 separate incidents. And this year alone, they've recorded more than 200 attacks on, they've recorded that 200 humanitarian workers have been attacked. When it comes to measures relating or as a result of COVID-19, of course, there have been flight suspensions, border closures, quarantine measures, lockdowns, curfews. Much of this triggers delays, additional costs, becomes harder to move. And a survey carried out in April of this year revealed that 74% of relief agencies have reported an impact on their programs because of the pandemic. This being said, of course, there are good practices, and in particular with respect to now COVID, we've seen a number of places where humanitarians have been considered to be essential staff for the purpose of moving freely, given exemptions to carry out their work, given laissez-passer, for example. And again, I need to mention international humanitarian law, that all these challenges that I've just described are despite the fact that in situations of armed conflict, at least IHL requires that all parties allow and facilitate the passage of impartial humanitarian relief for civilians in need, allow for the freedom of movement of humanitarians as required for their functions, and of course requires that all parties respect and protect humanitarian personnel and assets. There have been a number of initiatives, of course, to try and put an end to and prevent the challenges that I've just mentioned, including, of course, advocacy on IHL and initiatives to bring perpetrators of violations to justice. In 2019, the French and German governments came together to launch a call to action, or for action, to strengthen respect for international humanitarian law and principled humanitarian action. At this very moment, an organization called ACTED that tragically lost a number of humanitarian workers in Niger a month or so ago, have launched their own call to action for safeguarding humanitarian personnel, and in particular calling for better reporting and monitoring and potentially even sanctioning of perpetrators of attacks and hindrances on humanitarian personnel. I think another area another sort of development that is quite unique and has, while unique and positive in certain ways, no doubt has its flip sides. But in 2014, the UN Security Council adopted a resolution that decided to authorize UN and implementing partner humanitarian organizations to cross the border into Syria to carry out humanitarian operations, despite the fact that the Syrian government did not consent to those operations across its border. This resolution, adopted in 2014, has been renewed ever since. It is still alive today, although the 4 border crossings that we had at the outset have now been reduced to 1 in northwest Syria that is very active as humanitarians continue to try and reach a vast area in northern Syria through that 1 border crossing. It is not without immense politicization, but I think there is at least something we can say that it is a sign of the system working to ensure that IHL is respected and needs are met. Another way in which the Security Council has tried to sort of stop and potentially, hopefully, prevent hindrances and attacks on humanitarian operations is through sanctions. A number of sanctions regimes of the Security Council actually allow for sanctions against entities or individuals that obstruct humanitarian operations or carry out attacks, and it actually has been triggered in some contexts. A third area that is a big challenge for us, not just at the UN, but for all humanitarians, of course, is the impact of counterterrorism measures and sanctions on humanitarian activities. Of course, in themselves, measures to counter terrorism are legitimate, but they inadvertently, unintentionally end up catching and hindering humanitarian operations when humanitarian activities inevitably need to be carried out in areas where groups designated as terrorist or individuals designated as terrorist operate. And this clashes with what IHL allows explicitly in allowing impartial humanitarian organizations to offer their services to all parties to an armed conflict, including armed groups, for the benefit of those who are not or no longer fighting. And so counterterrorism measures or sanctions that aim to penalize or prevent the financing of terrorism, for example, might inadvertently sort of catch in their net incidental payments that humanitarians might inevitably have to make when they operate in areas where groups designated as terrorists are operating and in control, such as taxes, tolls, permits, and other fees. But in addition, donors to humanitarian organizations commonly impose quite strict funding conditions that will require some kind of approval of recipients before, or beneficiaries, I should say, before the aid organization receiving the funding can even deliver the aid. And that can and does clash with the independence of humanitarian organizations and can jeopardize the impartiality that they are expected to manifest throughout their operations. Banks can be very reluctant to deal with humanitarian organizations operating in certain areas. Their accounts have been closed, transactions have been delayed or blocked, and this can lead to delays and the shutdown of humanitarian operations. There's also a broader chilling effect for humanitarian organizations that are hesitant to operate in certain areas because of the range of repercussions that I've just described. This being said, again, back to a glimmer of hope, considering the immense sort of influence and sort of might behind counterterrorism measures, there's still room for humanitarians to make their point on all of this. And at least in New York, but I think in other parts of the world, this issue has been getting quite a bit of attention and is starting to find its way into Security Council resolutions, national legislation, as well as an EU directive to try and carve out safeguards for humanitarians to be able to operate where there are counterterrorism measures and sanctions in place that could, as I said, inadvertently, unintentionally catch humanitarian operations. And so we have an exemption for impartial humanitarian activities in the sanctions regime relating to Somalia. The resolution says that the sanctions relating to financial transactions do not apply to the payment of funds or other economic resources required for humanitarian operations by certain entities. And we have, as I've mentioned, an EU directive to this effect, as well as a growing number of national laws, for example, in Canada, in New Zealand, in the Philippines, that try to, again, carve out a safeguard for humanitarian operations in this context. So those are some of the challenges with, I hope, some glimmers of hope and avenues for progress. and I look forward to the discussion period. Thank you.
Natalie, thank you very much for this impressive tour d'horizon in just 15 minutes. I think what has come out very clearly in what you were saying is the funding issues that you as an operational entity are facing because of the current COVID situation, certainly, but also because of other restrictive measures relating to terrorism and so on. If I may just add one thought to that, I think we're going to see a shift of power also from public to private, because with all the rescue measures that we're currently seeing, we're incurring public debt on an enormous level. At the same time, we have private entities, new tech companies in particular, but others as well, that are gaining in power. And I wonder, that's a pervasive issue, how that is going to affect, I think, all of the issue areas we're discussing here today. And just to add on the glimmers of hope, and because you were looking into the issue of hunger reduction and armed conflict related hunger, the fact, I think, that the war crime of starvation has recently been added to the Rome Statute. It's not perhaps a big step, but in light of the types of conflict, of attrition that we're seeing in Syria, in particular Yemen, I think the war crime of starvation is an important step in the way forward. And we're just going to jump from big issue to big issue today, and I'll now hand over to Diane, who will look into socioeconomic inequalities. And just yesterday, the IMF chief again issued a very stark warning how the COVID situation is going to increase the problems on this side. So Diane, looking forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Robin, and my thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to discuss the development dimension in the work of the United Nations. It's a particularly apropos because, as was mentioned by Robin earlier in the introduction, this is the year where there will be a 21st session of the open-ended working group on the right to development. Last year, the Human Rights Council, as well as the General Assembly, both passed resolutions calling upon all member states to finalize the legally binding instrument on the right to development. My work, along with several other experts, was to draft such a legally binding instrument on the right to development. The draft convention on the right to development was thereafter adopted by the chair rapporteur of the open-ended working group, and this December 7 to 11, 2020, it will be taken up by the states for their deliberations. So possibly a glimmer of hope. There are many contemporary challenges, but at the same time, I do, in the overall theme of my discussion, find considerable hope in that there is no longer any significant dissonance within the United Nations in conceptualizing development also and primarily from the standpoint of the realization of human rights. That was not always such an easy concession to make, particularly when we look at the 1986 Declaration on the Right to Development, which purposely stopped short of including language that required that development should be conditioned or premised on the realization of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. The signal difference between the draft convention on the right to development and that 1986 Declaration on the Right to Development is precisely that when we conceive of the right to development, it is not just about the active participation, enjoyment, and contribution of every individual and all groups and peoples in civil, economic, social, and cultural development, but in the convention, it is consistent with and based on all human rights and fundamental freedoms. That has significant consequences, especially when we examine the development dimension and how the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, as well as the High Commissioner for Human Rights, during this particular COVID pandemic, have purposely espoused a strategy of human rights compliance in building back better. So if I may share my screen briefly, I will go and proceed with some of these challenges, at least to outline some of these challenges, as well as to point to certain developments that have actually seen improvements, and where we could stand with regard to the fulfillment of Agenda 2030 in the years ahead under these challenging times. The question, as I said, is how to realize the development dimension, especially in the work of the United Nations, given its intersecting relationships with all other work of the United Nations and its pillars. There have been 2 watershed reports that were just issued, and which I will not discuss in detail, but I'm pointing them out to the audience here. One is the Multidimensional Poverty Index for 2020, which identified various pathways, which is a report of the UN Development Program, which identified various pathways, particularly in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in a time of this strained resources, cooperation, as well as particularly resource capacity challenges and institutional capacity challenges for states. There is also the recent 2020 SDG report of the United Nations, which has several very illustrative graphs and charts about where we stand for the moment and where we could be going forward. I won't replicate all of them because for my purposes, I'd like to highlight several other matters in regard to the strategy of the United Nations today in intentionally embedding human rights in the realization of development. The World Bank, of course, just recently came out with its prognostications, particularly with the fact that there is a proliferation of recessions around the world that is expected to be quite extended. And if anything, the case for international cooperation and solidarity was highlighted by the World Bank's recent report, especially considering that the recessions that were brought out by the pandemic have seen the fastest, steepest downgrades in our overall growth projections for many states. So for many states that actually achieved a very significant growth, those reversals were very quickly achieved during the pandemic as a result of global shutdowns. So what are, in my view, some of the key human rights challenges to realizing the right to development and Agenda 2030 sustainable goals, development goals in a post-COVID situation? And this is where I think that intentional integration by the Secretary General, as well as by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as by the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly on the recognition of human rights as intrinsic to development is significant. Because what do we have today? We have an ongoing retrogression of the standards of protection for economic, social, and cultural rights during these protracted recessions, affecting both the global south and the global north, countries that are middle income countries, but most especially countries that are the least developed countries, and where we see aid drying up faster than development aid in particular, drying up faster in a time of pandemic. The second is the erosion of civil and political rights protection due to the increasing climate of national emergencies being invoked by various states and more authoritarian measures of surveillance and social control. I won't dwell on that because we have the distinguished special rapporteur, Professor Melzer, who will speak afterwards on human rights. The third is on the consistent observation that there is a lack of monitoring, oversight, transparency, and ultimately a lack of accountability, whether domestically or internationally, with respect to the decision-making processes that governments, institutions, and organizations are taking to address COVID-19. If anything, this is what is most disempowering under the notion of the right to development, where individuals, groups, and peoples are supposed to meaningfully participate and contribute in the development decisions that are being taken on their behalf. Lacking this monitoring, oversight, transparency, and accountability mechanism, there is hardly any meaningful path for individuals facing crises today on a day-to-day basis to comprehend, much less check, the kind of measures that are being imposed upon them. And finally, what is most concerning on my end is the intergenerational entrenchment of the long-term human rights impacts on development. And we're looking here at the particular dimensions of education, where we see increasing variability in the ability of students from different countries to access the necessary technologies and resources to ensure continuity in their education, where many educators have already pointed to a generational gap and crisis in primary and secondary education looming as a result of the inequalities in the provision of education and education infrastructure. A similar situation and circumstance occurs with respect to healthcare, where there are also variable capacities between states, and national resources alone are no longer sufficient to meet the challenges of local communities. We see this also in mass unemployment rather, especially in the developing world, when there have been many shutdowns, in particular many industries that have stopped production and resulted in mass layoffs and furloughs for many workers. But it is also something that is afflicting the developed world. The United States in particular, where I am at the moment, is also suffering from significant mass unemployment, but has the benefit, unlike developing countries, has the benefit of social security and some measure of social protection. This is where we find the biggest development emergency for the least developed countries, the middle income countries, the developing world, because not all countries, and as I'll discuss in the state of play, not all countries have robust social protection systems to begin with. When people lose their jobs in the developing world, there's not necessarily going to be a cushion with respect to paycheck protection, let alone assistance for housing or food stamps, such as what is available in the developed world. This is why it was particularly landmark for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, to come out with a statement just a few days ago, affirming that we do need human rights in terms of shared responsibility and global solidarity that itself goes to the soul of the right to development. And when she said that they should be integral to countries' plans, programs, and policies in implementing the SDGs, and the right to development is no exception, that, at least in my view, looking at the views of the Human Rights Council, the views of the General Assembly, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the unanimous views of the Secretary General, that at least tells us, that for me is a strong glimmer of hope. Where before there was considerable ambiguity as to whether or not the right to development was simply that of material or economic development as may be defined by a state for itself, this time around, the thrust of the United Nations is to emphasize that that development does indeed have to be premised on the respect, fulfillment, and protection of human rights. This is why in the draft convention on the right to development, we also emphasized in that draft, it's available on the UN website, duties of cooperation and not just voluntary solidarity measures, but duties of cooperation and international assistance, which are actually already found in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. We elaborated that further because those duties of international cooperation spell the difference with respect to the realization of the right to development, especially today when we stand to suffer, this world stands to suffer, long-term intergenerational entrenchment in the human rights impacts from COVID. So that said, let me in my remaining time take a look at some of the state of play for global development during COVID-19 and what are some of the key findings. I'm going to gloss over some of the preliminary language on Agenda 2030 because suffice it to say that Agenda 2030, as we all know, is indeed anchored on and premised on human rights, even if the document itself is not seen as straightforwardly a document or a source of international law. But what does envisage a world of universal respect for human rights and human dignity, the rule of law, justice, equality, and non-discrimination and equal opportunity, sustainable growth, democracy, good governance, and climate sensitivity and resilience. And yes, it is premised on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and international human rights treaties. So let me focus on 4 aspects where there have been serious challenges, but at the same time, some glimmers of hope. With respect to ending poverty, even before COVID-19, we were already somewhat off track from the 2030 target. But there was every confidence, at least, that with respect to ending extreme poverty, there was that glimmer of hope before COVID-19. However, this year, the poverty rate is projected to reach 8.8%, the first rise in global poverty since 1998. this figure of an additional 71 million people has actually been expanded to about 100 million people that will be living in extreme poverty due to COVID-19. This emphasizes the need now for development assistance and cooperation and solidarity, especially for the regions that will suffer the largest increases in extreme poverty, Southern Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. On ending poverty, there's also the intersectional considerations to take into account. Women and young workers during this pandemic are disproportionately affected by poverty and the elimination in particular of employment opportunities and relevant possible sources of income, with the informal sector being seriously hit in terms of unemployment and the loss of revenue. And again, 55% of the world's population, about 4 billion people, do not benefit from any form of social protection, at least as reported by the UN in 2016. This is serious because at a time of emergency today, we do not have robust social protection systems around the world, especially in the least developing countries, for mitigating the effects and preventing many people from falling into an unending poverty cycle. This also contributes to what Nathalie was discussing earlier on food insecurity and hunger, where already as a result of conflict and other related issues, there are already severe food insecurity affecting around 700 million people. And with the pandemic threatening food systems, agricultural small-scale production, there will be chronic undernourishment of children and a shifting of investments away from agriculture to meet other immediate fiscal emergencies. As to good health and well-being, this is something that probably doesn't need a lot of explanation. But in this case, one of the most important things to note is that there is a massive global deficit in achieving universal health coverage. That in itself is a massive crisis throughout the developing and the developed world when we face a pandemic that needs the accessibility of health coverage, particularly for individuals, groups, and populations that depend on the immediate access to medical care at this time, especially when there is no cooperation yet on realizing a global vaccine as a global public good. Finally, I'll focus on education, which I already said has been subject to severe inequalities around the world, when remote learning opportunities are out of reach for so many, when there are increased risks to the health and safety of children who are forced to go back to schools that are being reopened, when there is no significant safety infrastructure in place to prevent contagion under COVID-19. So what are, in closing, some of the challenges from a policy, legal, and institutional standpoint on the development dimension when it comes to reopening economies? With respect to legal challenges, there is the perennial question of whether the reopening plans comply with international law and human rights law, whether states consistent with the right to development do enable participation, contribution, and enjoyment by all members of their respective populations in these reopening plans, and whether there is full transparency of data relied upon by states with respect to the dimensions of these reopening plans. Institutionally and structurally, this is something that we hope is a glimmer of hope under the draft Convention on the Right to Development, where today we already find development assistance on the decline even before COVID-19. If the draft convention is passed, then duties of cooperation could potentially move states to meet their obligations of international cooperation and assistance that were already there under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. There's also a question of whether states would take a more active hand in market interventions, and what kind of readings of necessity or national emergency would they invoke in order to ensure continuous food and medical supplies. And from the standpoint of the UN, is there a system for coordinated monitoring and oversight of the COVID-19 responses around the world? Will states cooperate with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights with respect to the investigation of the nature of states' emergency responses to COVID-19? And finally, in an era of resurgent nationalisms, and as we know, weakening or threatened multilateralism, what space do we have for international solidarity and cooperation? This is what we seek to instantiate in the draft Convention on the Right to Development. And especially when it comes to understanding, reframing, or reforming the methodologies for SDGs, we purposely recommend as part of impact assessments, the intrinsic value of human rights assessments in determining the nature of global development as we understand it. Again, because the draft convention on the right to development looks at development from the standpoint of the human person as both the object, the subject, and the beneficiary of development, and to that end, must affirm in all dimensions the individual's capacity to realize, to respect, to protect, to facilitate, and to fulfill their fundamental human rights. That is not limited to the duties of states, and we recognize in the draft that the private sector also has, and civil society has a robust role in fulfilling the development dimension for the United Nations. I will stop here and look forward to continuing the rest of the discussion.
Diane, thank you very much for sharing your reflections on this very vast field, I should say. I think what you said directly links also to the Secretary General's plea for global solidarity from last week, where I think with a very ambitious agenda, he reflected on a new social contract, reflecting also on a universal basic income, global health cover, so a very progressive agenda. He also spoke of a new global deal, meaning a more even sharing of power and wealth globally. I always wonder with these very progressive agendas, with which I fully agree in this day and age, but I still wonder whether the UN is not putting itself in a vicious cycle of overpromising where it is sure to under-deliver. For the next 10 years, I think I have to be pessimistic. I think we're not going to see global health care cover or a universal basic income as much as I find that regrettable. Niels, over to you. Human rights challenges in this day and age. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you just give me a thumbs up? You can hear me? The audio is good? All right, very good. Well, thanks for having me on this panel. I think it is obviously very timely with the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And I'll be speaking to the human rights pillar, being one of the 3 pillars of the United Nations. Just to recall international peace and security, we've talked about disarmament already, development. We've just heard the current situation there as well, and universal respect for human rights. The UN Charter saying that it aims to create conditions of stability and well-being that are necessary for peaceful and friendly relations among nations through higher standards of living and solutions of international economic, social, and health-related problems, and universal respect for human rights. So this all interlinks. And the kind of constitutional document, obviously, for the human rights side of the United Nations is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, which recognizes the inherent dignity and the equal inalienable rights of all human beings as being the foundation for freedom, justice, and peace in the world. So, I mean, these are not empty words. These were, formulated by people who had just gone through one of the most horrendous wars in human history. And so it really speaks to the importance of human rights for global governance. We see that all these 3 pillars are mutually intertwined and interdependent. And I also would like to point out that the democratic principle requires that human rights and rule of law be at the basis for political legitimacy of sovereign power, because obviously the United Nations Charter also asserts sovereignty, but then sovereignty, if it's not based on human rights and the rule of law, does not have legitimacy. We've already also addressed the kind of sustainable development goals, which are a bit of the roadmap. It's not just a Christmas list of fancy goals, but this is the roadmap of how the United Nations intends to get the planet to make a reality out of these goals that are enshrined in the UN Charter, but also in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think so. So we have this, we have the roadmap, we have the constitution, so to speak, and many of the current challenges have already been mentioned, so I will not go into all tour d'horizon of these, but I'd like to just kind of summarize that what we're confronted with today is certainly three aspects I would like to point out specifically: a rapid evolution, diversification, globalization, and so of context, stakeholders, and technologies. So all these aspects play together. Secondly, what we see, we have a almost structural global governance crisis, which leaves states unable to effectively address basically any of the urgent political, technological, or socioeconomic and environmental challenges that we're confronted with. And we thirdly also see, therefore, I guess it's also a causal relation, we have a destabilization of the international rule of law through increasingly nationalist and discriminatory and divisive and violent political narratives, through lack of effective legal accountability and enforcement and oversight, and also almost arbitrary, increasingly bad faith interpretations of the applicable law, which would be designed to essentially bring these human rights into reality. So in the near future, I think what we will see is that we will see environmental, economic, technological, and demographic factors that will likely trigger an unprecedented political and social crisis and tensions, which leave the current, I'd say, Westphalian governance systems increasingly paralyzed. So we'll see that intensify. We already see not only the beginning, I think we're in the middle of it, but it's going to get worse before it gets better, in my view. And I think also that this, nothing less than the survival of humanity will depend on our ability to understand two basic points. First, that all major contemporary security threats are of global character. And I mean here human security, economic security, national security, environmental security. So it's not just a narrow notion of security. And because these are of a global character, they require a global response, not only by individual states, but by humanity as a whole. And this clearly brings in the United Nations, which is the only truly global organization that could actually take that role. And the most important component for any sustainable national, international, and global governance system really is human security at the core, and the respect for individual human dignity, because that's the starting point for everything. I pointed it out with regard to state sovereignty. That will not have any legitimacy if it's not based on respect for human rights and democratic principles, and so on. So the human being, well, not surprisingly, is at the center of a human-led governance system of this planet. So this being said, what reality are we facing here? And so I have to say, especially in my current mandate, I reported to the General Assembly 2 years ago at the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that I noted with alarm that torture and ill treatment continue to be practiced with virtual impunity throughout the world. And I think that's specifically notable because the right not to be tortured is probably the most widely recognized and unchallenged core human rights. It is considered to be jus cogens peremptory. No one ever challenges it seriously. States may argue that something is not torture, but the provision of torture is probably the most authoritative human right that we can identify. And still, torture is endemic throughout the planet. It takes different forms, it evolves, and I'm not going to delve into the details here, but that was my alarm. I rang the alarm bell. And today I have to say also this dark discrepancy that we see between the absolute and non-derogable prohibition of torture and the actual complacency that we see worldwide with this type of abuse is not a singular phenomenon that's limited to that human right, but it highlights actually a more generalized gap between the normative ambition that states have and governmental practice in actually protecting human rights. And so now, 75 years after the creation of the United Nations, that's a quite sobering observation, and it exposes the current systemic incapacity of our contemporary governance systems to actually eradicate torture or to fulfill the promises of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and therewith also of the United Nations Charter, and as well to achieve the ambitions of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I think I'm not trying to be too pessimistic here. I think I want to be realistic. The current governance systems are not capable of achieving that, not any of them. And I think we have plenty of proof for that. I'm not saying they're not good intentions, but we're not capable with the current systems to actually achieve it, to make it happen. And so in my current report to the General Assembly, and I'm giving a little bit of a preview here, since the advanced copy has already been published, is that I've looked at the root causes of this, and certainly with regard to the prohibition of torture. And what I've discovered really is that the root cause for the systemic governance failure that we're talking about is not lack of expertise or lack of resources or a lack of normative consensus, really. But it is, and it's not even generalized malicious intent, but it is based in generic biopsychosocial factors, so biological, evolutionary, psychosocial factors that have shaped human decision-making throughout history, irrespective of national, cultural, or religious or other distinctive factors. And so I've investigated this together with very established psychologists, social psychologists, neurobiologists that try to bring these findings together and to apply it for the human rights area. And I think one of the most shocking revelations for me was that, contrary to presumptions of rationality and morality that are really omnipresent in the human rights dialogue and that underlie modern statehood, most individual and collective decision-making really in reality remains guided by largely unconscious emotional impulses. And human beings in all cultures and in all situations tend to pursue perceived short-term self-interest, and not necessarily what's wise and good for the survival of the species, but short-term self-interest. And these decisions that are taken unconsciously are afterwards, ex post facto, rationalized in line with the predominant social expectations and the legal system. So I'm stating science here. It's not my, some kind of a speculation. There's plenty of science actually confirming that. And that also applies to complex collective decision-making processes that are essential for the integrity and effectiveness of constitutional institutions and procedures, political elections, appointments, judicial decisions, administrative oversight, and even the media, the independent media reporting, are affected by these unconscious decision-making processes. And so where does this lead us? Because self-interested, unconscious, self-interested decision-making leads, at least in my field, certainly very often to torture and ill treatment. It's, you're trying to defend yourself, you have this survival instinct that kicks in and enables people, armed forces, states, intelligence agents, and so on, to actually break the law, and in order to do that. So it brings them into moral dilemmas, this self-interested decision-making. And these moral dilemmas are, again, I'm stating psychosocial science observations here. Again, they trigger largely unconscious self-deceptive patterns that we call moral disengagement. It's denial of fact. Yeah, it doesn't happen. We're not torturing. We're giving it another name, or a denial of responsibility. We're outsourcing it to private actors, to other states. We're we're not pushing back migrants at the Mediterranean, but we finance the Libyan Coast Guard to actually pull them back, and then we claim we've never had jurisdiction. So we deny responsibility, or we deny the wrongfulness by trivializing what's happening. And these patterns I see reoccurring all the time, even in debates of the General Assembly, the Security Council, at the Human Rights Council. And it's not bad intentions. It's not a moral issue. It's a neurobiological issue. And I think we have to become realistic about who we are as a species and how we function, and what factors actually can affect this behavior in a positive sense, so we can actually achieve the development goals and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Charter and so on. And so in here, I just want to come to also what I propose in this sense. So we have to first acknowledge there are not good people and bad people. We're all human beings. We all have this tendency of interpreting reality in line with our unconsciously decided self-interest. And so we are not capable to self-control. It's not possible. That's why we need external oversight mechanisms, and they need to be effective. These tendencies otherwise will always lead to a disbalance and to abuse of law and to a destructive reinterpretation and all the effects that we've just been recounting for an hour now. So, as has been mentioned also by Diane, transparency, accountability, oversight is absolutely essential. If we authorize a government to simply declare immunity and maintain secrecy of its decision processes, have an intelligence service that cannot be effectively controlled, we are asking for trouble. And we can see that worldwide, not only in the torture that is resulting from these types of things, but also in the other disbalances that essentially lead to the destruction of the planet and our environment and also society as a whole. So we need transparency. We cannot have government processes that are protected by secrecy. There is a space for confidentiality of private sphere, but government processes and exercise of power needs to be effectively controlled by outside instances that are not involved in self-interested decisions in the specific case. We need effective accountability systems, and on all this, in international law, we all know we don't have that, and for a reason, because obviously self-interested decision prevents that from happening. We have to ensure that media institutions remain independent from governments, but also from big businesses, and governance remain independent from big businesses, because there we have extremely powerful, it's not evil, it's just naturally conditioned self-interest combined with a lot of financial power and political power. It will lead to, unfortunately, arbitrariness and corruption, inevitably. And so what I'm advocating for is really that we see the importance of transparency and accountability, and that we acknowledge that we don't demonize some countries and some people and idealize ourselves or our own system, but we become honest about who we are as human beings, and that we actually start saying, this is who we are, this is where we want to go, and with the system we have in the middle today, we will never get there. So what do we have to change? Because we can't change our nature so far. What do we have to change in the system? It's like a mathematical equation. So we get what we need and what we have declared to be our intentions in these foundational documents that I have mentioned before. And here, I think the United Nations can have a very central role. I think mandates like the one I have a very specific thematic role, function, but it's very important. And states should learn to trust us that we're not trying to interfere with their sovereignty, but that we're actually trying to help them achieve their own goals and to overcome these natural tendencies that all of us have and that we have to learn to deal with. So I'll close here. I'll be happy to take questions as well. And I thank you again for your attention and for indeed having this event.
Niels, thank you very much for this sneak peek into your forthcoming report. We feel very privileged. Also, thank you for, exploring, I think, yet again, new facets of your mandate and issues that should probably be discussed more often at the Human Rights Council and other fora, and that certainly underpin many of the woes we're facing today. In the meantime, and in the background, we have been collating some of your questions, of which we've received many. I would suggest that we now go in reverse order. And I'll pose a specific question to each of you coming from the audience. Looking at the clock, I would like to ask you for relatively brief answers, if possible, so that we can do a second round. Niels, others have already spoken a lot about the impact of the pandemic. Diane and Natalie have done so, but I think people would be interested to hear from you how you feel the pandemic is affecting human rights. And I guess there are some obvious answers there. Many of the panels that I've been watching of late, they often conclude with the same theme coming from a German poet, Hölderlin, where the danger is great, rescue also grows. Looking forward, what do you think for human rights, what could come out of the current crisis situation? And please keep your answer fairly brief.
Well, you're asking me the impossible, but what should I say? Well, I'm confronted on a daily basis with the dramatic consequences of COVID, specifically in prisons and where families no longer have access, they cannot provide the food, and so all of these extremely dramatic consequences of COVID, the lockdown, the house arrests, basically the curfews and so on. I think they show the vulnerability of our systems to these types of things, and I would agree that where, at least I would maybe put it in different words, but I would say that where the crisis is so marked and where rights are being so obviously put in danger, and where the vulnerabilities are so exposed, the chance it gives to us, and this is part of what I encouraged before, is to become more honest about what the reality is and where the strengths and weaknesses of our systems are, and how wide the discrepancy to our intended and declared goals, and therefore might help us to also identify the right measures to address these things. We'll not develop this further in detail because otherwise it will become a lecture, but thank you for asking this question.
Thank you. And so with regard to the other questions, and I'll just go through the list here before actually turning over to the panelists. So for Diane, recurrently the audience, members from the audience have asked about the impact of climate change and how that might clash with efforts to enhance the right to development. So if you could maybe elaborate on that. And then just in going forward, looking at the questions, Natalie, there was a specific question about the legitimacy of humanitarian operations, enhancing that legitimacy in humanitarian operations dealing with non-state actors and states. And Michael Biantino, again, there was a question about the pandemic and how that may impact disarmament, biological and chemical weapons in particular. So if we can start with Diane, the clash between efforts to tackle the climate crisis and the right to development and how that might play out.
Thank you, Robin. My short answer is, with respect to the right to development, if it is recognized under the draft convention on the right to development, there will be no clash. Precisely because Article 4 of that convention requires that the right to development is realized in a manner consistent with and based on human rights and all fundamental freedoms. And we expressly said in the commentaries that this would specifically include environmental obligations, especially on climate change. Short answer, there should be no clash with climate change and development.
Thank you. And Natalie, the legitimacy of humanitarian operations, obviously, again, another big issue, but if you could share some reflections on that question, that would be very welcome.
Sure, it's a extremely legitimate question. I mean, it's a constant effort that all humanitarians on the ground have to make to gain acceptance. That's how I understand the legitimacy being used here. So that goes without saying. I want to just kind of recall, though, that IHL, generally speaking, legitimizes impartial humanitarian operations in situations of armed conflict, recognizing explicitly that offers of services can be made and requiring that all parties allow and facilitate passage without impediment. So that needs to be recalled as the starting point, but of course the challenge and the effort is constant to gain acceptance by working with also a whole range of actors in communities in order to be able to reach those in need and gain the acceptance and the passage and the sort of the freedom to move. But I don't want to suggest that sort of the challenges in doing that justify any kind of breach or of IHL through attacks or misappropriation or looting or kidnapping or harassment. I think it's important to distinguish the two. And also, I think, link back to a point I was making about the impact of counterterrorism measures, including sometimes sanctions, and how, for example, through funding agreements, there are conditions that can actually clash with that very need to gain legitimacy. And so if, for example, an aid agency as a condition of funding needs to get the acceptance of the funder before it can deliver to individuals under the control of a certain group or affiliated in some loose manner with a certain terrorist group, then that can jeopardize their legitimacy and their acceptance with, as they operate under in areas where those groups operate. And so I think there's some real jeopardy in how counterterrorism measures are being exercised right now, as they kind of sort of trap in their net humanitarian operations. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Michael Biontino, the impact of the corona crisis on disarmament, especially with respect to the so-called poor man's weapons of mass destruction.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention for a long time had been seen as established norms regulating or prohibiting the use of biological agents or chemical agents by state actors. In terms of what the COVID crisis is new, there is, of course, something which goes beyond these two conventions, is, I mean, the role that non-state actors could play, essentially. And the problem we have in the established disarmament architecture is it mainly addresses state actors. It does not address non-state actors, in particular in failing states. So indeed, the COVID crisis and what we see a simple virus can do poses questions on how we manage within these conventions, actions by non-state actors in failing states. I think this is a real crisis we would have to address. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And then we had a very, I think, nice question, overarching question, which is addressed, I think, to everyone on the panel, and whoever wants to pick it up, please do so. The question was whether the UN has aged well. And I would add to that, can we find any consolation by taking the long view on things? I mean, this is the 75th anniversary. If we go back 75 years, and consider how far we have come in spite of all the crisis themes that we're facing today, and the corrosion and the erosion. But if we look back 75 years, there wasn't any meaningful human rights mechanism or norm in place, at least not on the international level. No refugee protection, not even a genocide convention 75 years ago. Some states officially racist. And of course, many of these issues continue today. But I think in what has happened in the meantime, also in protecting minorities of different forms, we've come quite a way. And if we look to the future, and maybe not 75 years, which is really reading tea leaves, of course, in these dynamic times, but perhaps if we look into the next quarter century, the next 25 years, would you dare to make any predictions? Can you spot any milestones of how we could turn things around, rebuild global trust, and move on from the current overwhelming sense of crisis? Niels, you had your physical.
Yeah. I think that I mean, clearly the UN is a giant leap forward compared to what we had before. It was triggered by what I don't have to describe. It was triggered by the Second World War, which improved what we had before that, which was the League of Nations, which again was triggered by the First World War. So if we think that forward, I would be very happy if we could avoid improving the UN through a third world war. But you know, what we see is that the current system that is, as I said, a giant leap forward, it's still not good enough to actually solve our current problems. And either we can actually realize that with our intelligence and improve it in peaceful terms, or we will have another major crisis that will then kind of, you know, allow us to rebuild a better system on the rubble. I don't have to tell you which option I prefer. Thank you.
Diane, please.
I think insofar as the development dimension is concerned, Robin, absolutely. I think the UN has aged well. We are no longer in the era when development was an individual state enterprise, or rather was conditioned simply on individual political agendas. There is so much that's taking place on cooperation, on assistance, and in particular in different facets of development assistance that the UN has helped galvanize and spearhead in concert with all the other multilateral institutions. That kind of effort cannot be rallied by any single state or any single regional organization. I think it's an inevitable path, and that's where the UN has a distinct advantage in this respect.
Thank you. Natalie.
Thank you. Just very quickly, I mean, I still see great potential, absolutely, in what the UN can offer, without a doubt, not just because they pay me. But yes, I can tell you that in my daily work, I see efforts to turn over every stone possible in order to enhance the possibility of, you know, of facilitating humanitarian operations and to minimize suffering in humanitarian crises. You know, whether it's through peacekeeping operations, through Security Council, again, counterterrorism and sanctions efforts where, you know, humanitarians come in and say, yes, but it's through mechanisms to monitor violations relating to children in armed conflict. It's you know, through GA mechanisms. It's ongoing. I mean, currently we're drawing up multiple pages of examples of mechanisms that have been in place, are already in place, or have been proposed in order to enhance this and see how we can actually amplify them or refine them. So there is this constant effort to turn over every stone to keep this space open. But I guess to go to what Niels was saying, what I fear is, and it's what you were saying as well, is that in the foreseeable future, unless we can come up with that equation that Niels was talking about and implement it, I fear that the challenges will remain. The tendencies and the challenges that I've described in humanitarian action will remain. If you look back at the very first report of the Secretary General on the protection of civilians, and you compare it with every single one since, almost every year, sometimes not quite every year, the descriptions are the same. I was once asked to look back on the last 10 years, and an idea I had was that I would read a 10-year-old report and ask students whether this was today or 10 years ago, because they probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And so I think that challenge remains until, Niels, you can give us that magic equation. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Michael Biantino.
Yeah. Has the UN aged well for the arms control disarmament world? I think I would turn the question around. What are the alternatives? Arms control disarmament is going through right now through a relatively or very difficult period. We see a renationalization of security with emerging strategic competition. Security seen as zero-sum game. The gain of one is the loss of the other, and a turning away from cooperative approaches to security. These are very unpalatable sort of developments. And I only see the United Nations as the forum to redress that, to turn that around. At the same time, we see a remilitarization of security. Security only being seen in terms of weapon systems and means and ways to defend against these weapon systems. The larger security approach that was more predominant in the past, including development, economic, political issues, human rights, all the other issues, is being sort of marginalized right now, at least when it comes to arms control and disarmament. And I think, again, here, the UN is the only forum to redress that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think I'm happy to report, and I wasn't sure I'd be able to report this, but I'm happy to say that I think we all agree that in spite of all the challenges, the UN is still the only entity to base our hopes on to move out of this era of global turmoil right now. So that brings us to the end of this panel. Will the audience please join me in a round of virtual applause to our panelists for their very thought-provoking presentations and inspiring interventions. Please also join me in another round of virtual applause for the people that have been making this possible by leading from behind. Alexandra Sobirey and Asli Olkay, who's the academic coordinator of the Glasgow Centre of International Law and Security, who have helped with the delivery of this event. Thanks very much. Please join us again for the other events that we've scheduled further down the road throughout the year. And I very much hope that I'll be seeing many of you physically before long. Bye-bye. Thank you very much for being with us today.